So joining us now is Dr. Susanna Hills. She's a pediatric airway surgeon and the author of a recent CNN op-ed warning of complications in COVID cases that she is personally seeing in children. Doctor, thanks so much for being here. So we just showed that graph of the number of cases in kids that has just gone up. I mean, you can see it in the graph how exponentially it's gone up. What are you seeing on the ground in your hospital?
Well, I've seen the whole spectrum of how COVID's affecting kids because I'm an airway specialist dealing with a whole range of kids. So I see some asymptomatic children. I've seen children come back to me months after having had COVID with symptoms, and I'm called on to take care of kids in the ICU who are on ventilators sometimes.
So let me just stop you there because, I mean, we just don't, obviously when this all began, we didn't think that kids would be sick enough to be on ventilators. And so the kids that you're seeing on ventilators, how many are you seeing, and are these kids with underlying conditions, or were these previously healthy kids?
Well, we know, and in my personal experience, it's been the case that the majority of kids that I've seen get really sick have been kids with other illnesses as well, or comorbid conditions. But now the difference with this Delta variant is that we're seeing also kids who may not necessarily have comorbid conditions also end up in the hospital with illness. And we're seeing children, too, end up in the hospital with COVID and another illness like respiratory syncytial virus, another illness that can affect the airways. Fortunately, in New York, schools aren't open yet, so we're not seeing the same surge among children that other states where schools have reopened, who may not have the same mask measures in place that they may need to keep schools safe. We're not seeing the same cases yet, but I'm really concerned for what we might see in the coming weeks as schools reopen here in New York.
I want to ask you about that because the general feeling, the conventional wisdom was that kids need to be in school. I mean, for a host of reasons, from their mental health to obviously their learning. As what you're seeing, I mean, as an airway specialist and having to deal with kids, do you think it's time right now for millions of kids who they can't be vaccinated? I mean, obviously through no choice of their own, they are not eligible yet to be vaccinated. Is now the time to send millions of kids back to school?
Well, the thing I want people to know, Alisyn, I want people to remember that this virus is preventable. We do have some control over how this pans out, even if kids are back in school. So we all understand how important schooling is for kids. They do really need to be back in that setting to catch up, to get the kind of development they need. And things like masking, like vaccinating everyone who's eligible, hand washing, keeping kids a little separated. These things we know from last year as well. We've plenty of studies from North Carolina and Wisconsin and the CDC study from Georgia that show that these measures will keep kids safe. So yes, I think we can send kids back to school, but what we're seeing as schools are reopening in states where mask mandates aren't necessarily in place, where not as many people are vaccinated, we're seeing kids ending up in quarantine, and we have some control over that.
If your child gets COVID or gets a positive test result from COVID after going to school, what should parents do? Is there anything you should treat them with? I mean, what do you need to be on the lookout for?
So generally speaking, supportive measures are what we recommend. If your kid is having any symptoms that might suggest COVID or a respiratory illness, please get them tested, because then the family will know and the school can know that yes, there was an exposure. And then that child should be isolated at home, getting well for 2 weeks and then testing again so they can test negative for the virus, hopefully down the road. But supportive measures are what we recommend.
But what are those?
So hydration and rest and hand washing of everybody around this child, trying to keep that child separated from other people in the household. All of those things will help keep the virus isolated and help keep it contained. And that's what we want. We want to contain kids who are positive and try to let them recover and get well with just supportive treatment with basic measures at home. Kids who are really struggling to breathe, if it seems like they're having labored breathing, if you're worried about how they're doing, if they're spiking really high fevers, then talk to your pediatrician. And of course, we're here in the hospital in emergency rooms for emergencies, but if there are questions, we would recommend reaching out to your pediatrician first and running it by them and seeing what they recommend too.
Very quickly, I remember when my twins were little, they got RSV and how scary that respiratory virus was when they got RSV and they had to be on the nebulizer and all of that stuff. I understand there might be a spike in RSV also. Are you seeing that?
Yeah, it's happening early this year. It's happening all across the country, especially in areas where COVID cases are high. Hospitals are being really stretched thin with resources for children because they're getting spikes of RSV with spikes in COVID. And RSV can be really scary. It's one of those diseases I dread every year as well, because these are some of the sickest kids we're called on to take care of when they're not breathing well, and they can require all kinds of assistance like nebulizers and breathing machines and ventilators. So it's really a challenge, and it's hurting a lot of hospital systems to have the RSV spike alongside this COVID spike that's happening now.
Okay, so my takeaways are hand washing and make sure that all of the adults around every kid are vaccinated, because that will cut down on a child's risk.
Yes.
Dr. Hills, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We really appreciate you coming in.